Hello, everybody, and welcome to Radical Democracy. Thank you for listening. I'm Maddie Cheers, and we are with our special guest today, Kay Olin, Mohawk storyteller. And I would also like to say that because Kay will be calling in, you guys won't be able to call in, but you can send me texts. You can comment on the show, and I should be able to see all of that, although I know I was terrible at it last week, but hopefully I can do it this week. And anyway, thank you for listening, and I just want to introduce Kay and thank her for being here today. This is a very special experience for us. So, Kay, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Maddie, for inviting me to speak with you today. And I really appreciate every chance that I have to talk about Native American storytelling and to discuss why it's so important. I do encourage people when they are researching anything about Native people or to investigate who their sources are. I think it's important to know where the information comes from, and so because of that, I very often will introduce myself, explain a little bit about myself so that people know who I am. So as Maddie, as you said, my name is Kay Olin, but my Mohawk name is Yonadaewas. And I belong to the Wolf Clan. The Mohawk traditionally have three clans, the turtle, the bear, and the wolf. And I'm Wolf Clan because my mother was Wolf Clan, and her mother was Wolf Clan, and her mother before that was Wolf Clan. We are matrilineal. We follow the kinship lines of the women. And so when we introduce ourselves, we say our name and our nation and our clan. And we also like to say some words about peace, and I hope that you're all having a peaceful day today, a good day. And I spent a lot of my growing up years on Long Island. I lived there with my sister, my mother, and my dad. But every summer of my life, we would go to Akwesasne, my mother's reservation, which is located not too far from Messina, New York, Malone, New York. I like to, when people don't know where those places are, I like to ask them to envision New York State as being in the shape of the side of a boot. So if you look at New York, a map of New York State, if you try to envision it as the side of a boot, and you lace up that boot where you would tie the bow, that's pretty much where Akwesasne, my reservation, is located. And some people call it the St. Regis Mohawk Indian Reservation. So I spent just about every summer of my life there visiting my mother's family, my grandparents when they were alive, my uncles and aunts and cousins and friends, and I still do. And I was very fortunate because quite a few of my family members were very involved with trying to keep our culture alive. And so I heard a lot of discussion and met a lot of wonderful people as I was growing up. And then later on, I became a school teacher, and I taught for a while on Long Island, and then I taught in Wappingers Falls, up near south of Poughkeepsie, New York. I taught elementary school. And that's when something happened in my life. I don't remember exactly what year it was, but New York State Department of Education changed the social studies curriculum and asked fourth grade teachers to teach their students local history, including about the native peoples of their particular area. But the problem was that at that time, there wasn't a lot of information out there that was appropriate for that age, and sometimes whatever information was out there wasn't necessarily accurate. And so the teachers in my building where I was teaching at the time came to me and asked for some suggestions. And I started to bring in information to share with them until one day I brought in a set of slides that had been given to me by a history professor at SUNY New Paltz, Dr. Hauptman. And I started to explain those slides, but it was a lot of information for the teachers to try to absorb in just a few minutes before the school day began. And so when I saw the frustration on their faces, I said, well, if you'd like, maybe I could come down to your classroom during my preparation period and I could talk to your students. And they said that would be great. And so I did that, and I guess they liked it because they actually approached the Board of Education and asked them to hire a part-day sub to cover my class once a year so that I could spend a little bit more time with their students. Word got out. I started getting calls from people asking if I would come and give presentations, and sometimes I could and sometimes I couldn't because I had a full-time job. But I would try to think of whoever I could recommend that they call that might be able to do it if I couldn't. And then one day a woman called and asked if I would if I knew of somebody that could come and tell stories. And I was trying to think who I could recommend when she said, well, do you know any stories, Native American stories? And I said, well, yes, I've heard them, but I've never told them. And she said, would you come and try to tell them? So I did, and that's when people started saying I was a storyteller. And I wasn't too comfortable with the idea because I didn't think of myself as an entertainer. Right. But when I thought about it some more, and I thought, well, this is an opportunity for me to come into a classroom as an educator and use the stories to get my foot in the door and try to tell them in some sort of cultural context so that hopefully I could dispel some of the stereotypes that people had about Native people. So I used storytelling to open that door so that I could put on my teacher's hat and teach a little bit about who we are, who we were, and who we are. And a lot of those stories, I learned in different places. So many of them I learned from a man named Ray Fadden, Tohono O'odham, who was a teacher, a science teacher, and taught in many reservation schools. And he would tell his students, if you work real hard and you do well, and there's time at the end of the period, I'll tell you stories about your culture and about the environment and about your history. And on weekends, he would take some of his students on field trips to see what people were doing with their lives to help their communities. And so a lot of his students grew up to be leaders later on, people who, instead of feeling ashamed of who they were, felt pride in who they were because Ray helped to instill that pride. And when he retired, he built a museum in the Adirondack Mountains called the Six Nations Indian Museum. It's located between Saranac Lake and Paul Smith College in a town called Anchiota. And it's only open in the summer times, and Ray has since passed on, but his son John and his grandsons continue to run the museum. And it's a place where many Native and non-Native people go to learn about who we are and to share ideas, problem solve with one another, and to share stories. Ray would always make sure there was time to tell stories, and his son John and his grandchildren carry on that tradition.
And that's
So
so
I heard a
wonderful.
lot of stories there from Ray and John and Dave Fadden.
Wonderful. And what that's what one of the things I think that children need today. I know that when we go into schools and we do storytelling, the kids just want more, and they don't they don't even kids that are tough to deal with, they'll be there with us. They'll quiet down, they'll listen to the story, they'll ask questions, they'll tell you what they heard, the lessons. And I think that they feel like they don't have a connection to elders, to their community. That comes up a lot. About they'll ask me, well, what are our stories? Do we have any stories? And we can relate that to movies. We can say some movies have stories, and certainly some there are lessons in that. We have books like Harry Potter, and there are lessons in that. But that one-to-one storytelling tradition is completely lost in our culture, as much as some of us are trying to bring it back, because the change in children when you tell a story to them, and even adults, is remarkable. The calming effect, the connection between the storyteller and the listener is just something everybody should see and experience, and it only happens live.
Hmm. Yeah. And in our tradition, I was told that after a storyteller would finish telling a story, that there would be time for discussion,
Yes.
afterwards, whether it had to do with the story or something else, but that story opened the door to that opportunity to have discussion and a sharing of experiences and dreams and ideas and hopes for the future, and to make connections with each other and connections with our personal lives through whatever was going on in that story.
And I think that's what's really important to kids today. A lot of times, kids don't feel like their voice is heard, and the adults aren't talking to them in a way that they can relate to very often. We've had many teachers and many students tell us that there's just not time to have conversations. So I'm teaching you everything I need to teach you because I have this set amount of time to do it. And then it's hard to have the conversation as a group because the curriculum is so tight and so controlled and static, so that it becomes very difficult to sit with kids and have time to converse. And then of course they get home and they're very, very busy, so we hear the same thing from parents that I don't have time, I'm coming from work. But what I really find important is the story itself as the vehicle for creating the discussion, for letting you know what the kids are thinking, for letting them know what you're thinking, for letting them know what you think the lesson in the story is. And often I'll think a story has one lesson and they'll come up with 3 or 4 I'd never thought of. And that's what I love about Native American storytelling, is that it works on so many levels. And I think the other day when we were talking, you were saying that you tell the story whether you're in a group of adults or you're in a group of kids or you're a group that's mixed. You're going to tell the story the way the story needs to be told.
Yes, yes. I went to a teacher conference many, many years ago, and about 2 years after that conference, and at the conference I was talking about Native storytelling, and 2 years later I ran into somebody who had attended that conference. She was a teacher, and she said thank you, because she walked into her classroom one day, and she had a student that was really having a rough time, and she didn't know why. She didn't know if something had happened on the bus or at home or in the classroom, or if the student wasn't feeling well, or exactly what it was. And she tried everything she could think of to try to figure out what was going on and to make things better. And she wasn't getting anywhere. And in the meantime, the student wasn't able to interact. The student wouldn't say anything to anybody, wouldn't pick up his pencil, and just really wasn't able to function. So she decided to give her other students an assignment, and while they were working on that, she took this one student aside and she sat next to him and she told him a story that I had told at that teacher conference. And it had a very funny ending. It was a story that I had learned from Ray Fadden. And she said at the end, the student just started to laugh, and she started to laugh. And they, just looked at each other. They had shared a moment, and then that student picked up his pencil and got to work.
Yes. Oh.
So the story probably had nothing to do with that student's problem, whatever it was, but sharing that moment together and that story, sharing an experience, allowed that student to be able to put that problem aside for the time being, and hopefully he'd be able to deal with it later on. But now he was able to function again and get on with his life, at least, for that afternoon.
Right. And
that's the power of stories.
That absolutely is. And I think that even though I misunderstood something we talked about the other day when I was talking with a friend today, I was thinking, we need a national storyteller to start Congress, because what happens when people are listening to a story, like you had said earlier, is that you calm down, everybody's focused, it brings you together with that one heart, one mind. Everybody's listening. And I'd love if you'd go into that explanation of picking up your ears like rabbits. I love that.
Yeah. Well, before I do that, I would like to add something to what you just mentioned.
Sure.
That we should start meetings of importance with a story. In our culture, and when I say our, I'm talking about the Haudenosaunee, and this is something I usually do when I do a presentation is define my terms, because
Yes.
there's certain terms I use that might confuse people. Otherwise, I can't speak for all Native people, and I don't try to. But what I do try to do is share what I can about the Haudenosaunee. So what that is as you introduced me as a Mohawk storytelling, well, the Mohawk people are one nation that belong to a United Nations. And that United Nations, some people call the Five Nations, because it includes the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca Nations. Some people call it the Six Nations, because later on in the 1700s, the Tuscarora people came up from North Carolina to our territory to seek sanctuary. Some people call us the Iroquois or Iroquois Confederacy. So the Iroquois is not a nation, it's a United Nations.
Wonderful.
But in our languages, we refer to it as either Haudenosaunee or Haudenosaunee, depending on which language you're using. And those terms, most people translate them as the builders of the Longhouse or the people of the Longhouse, because we used to live in long bark-covered houses. Today we live in houses similar to everybody that you know that live in our communities. And so when you hear Five Nations, Six Nations, Iroquois Confederacy, Haudenosaunee, Haudenosaunee, those are five different names for the same thing, for this United Nations, for this peace confederacy that was formed, some say 1,000 years ago, some say 2,000 years ago.
Right.
And my nation is the Kanien'kehá:ka, which is the real way to say Mohawk. And that's one of the nations that belongs to the Haudenosaunee. the people of the Longhouse. So when I'm talk about our culture, I'm talking about the culture of the Haudenosaunee. I can't speak for all of the hundreds of different Native nations. And in our culture, we have something called the Ahondon Galiwatekwon, which some people like to call the Thanksgiving address or the opening address or greetings to the natural world. And literally it means the words that come before all else.
Yes.
And when we have meetings of importance or ceremonies, or even when we're starting as individuals each new day, we say the Ahondon Galiwatekwon to do exactly what you were talking about, to focus on what's important, to remind us of who we are and what our responsibilities are toward ourselves, each other, and the rest of the natural world. And it's very simply saying hello, thank you, and I love you to every part of the natural world. And that's what we're supposed to do each day and at the beginning of meetings. And it's supposed to bring our minds together, as you were talking about, and help us to focus on why we have come together. And it's not exactly storytelling, but it's reminding ourselves of our purpose and who we are and why we're here.
And it's
So it's kind of like telling ourselves our own story.
Yes, it is. It is. I think that's brilliantly put, Kay. It is like telling ourselves our own story. It is reminding ourselves that we are not here alone and that we are connected to all of these things and each other, and we are responsible to all of these things and each other. And like I've told you before, and I've said on the program before, to me, the Great Law of Peace is a design for honoring individuals while honoring the community. So we as human beings, we want to honor who we are, but we also cannot forget our responsibilities to each other and every living creature on the planet. And that's a lot of where the storytelling can come in to remind us, certainly the Thanksgiving address, for me especially, but also for many, many people that I know that have been exposed to it, and certainly for children. They love that. And we know from science now that just hearing somebody say thank you can change the serotonin level in your brain. You don't even have to be the one saying thank you. So imagine a whole group sitting around saying thank you, and it's a wonderful feeling.
Yes, yeah. And so when we sit around and hear someone tell a story, whether it's a personal story or an old story, a new story, funny story, scary story, whatever the story is, even historical stories, it gives us the opportunity to share an experience together. And the hope, one of our spiritual leaders, his name is Ogogwenungwas, Tom Porter, and many times he'll mention that when he's speaking to a group of people, that he hopes that they will put up their ears really tall, like a rabbit,
right.
so that we can take in more. It's creating this picture in our minds of us really listening that much harder, so we can take in new ideas and new words and other viewpoints, so that we can really make the most of our experience together.
Right. And I think that you said something the other day when we were talking about how when you are receptive to listening and hearing, then it dissipates fear. And fear is what closes our ears and our minds and our hearts. And I think we see that a lot today. I think we see a lot of reactionary statements by our politicians, by people who aren't politicians, sometimes our friends, sometimes our family, that a lot of things are going on where people are reacting from a place of fear, And when we do that, we cannot come to any kind of understanding with each other. And it's that understanding that's going to lead us to a place where we are not afraid of each other, where we can come together, where we can bridge those gaps between us, between other cultures.
On a personal level, I've always thought that fear comes from not knowing, comes from ignorance.
Yes.
And that fear leads to anger, and anger leads to war.
Yes.
And so what we really need to do if we want to live in a world of peace is to educate one another.
Yeah.
So that we don't have those fears, and so that it won't ripple effect into anger and fighting. It's called using our gift of reason.
Yes.
And the late great John Mohawk, Seneca scholar, he talked about that quite a bit. That we have that gift of being able to reason. And
right.
we need to use it.
Exactly. And I always like to bring up to the kids because, there's a lot of teaching in school now about STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. And my dad is a rocket scientist. And he always told us that creating science is no different than creating art. And he also was a great lover of all things Native American, and partly as we got older, as I got into it and he and I started discussing these things, and partly because he sees Native American people as scientists, that they were psychologists, they were mathematicians, they figured out the laws of physics before we did. There's some one of the powerful things for him has to do with that connection between science and the way that Native Americans view the world. And also, and he's a spiritual person. He is definitely a believer in the Creator, along with being a rocket scientist. So he's an interesting person to talk to, and I often find that what he has to say, or what Albert Einstein had to say about relating to people and education and creativity, all relates back to things that were done in my experience with talking with you and Tom about the Haudenosaunee, like how the grandparents would teach the children, but also look for what their gift was. How could they contribute to the community? Who were they going to be in the community? Everybody was going to contribute, but if you're looking for somebody's gift when they're a child and honoring that, then they grow up to feel honored, to feel respected, and to give respect. And we have to be very careful when we are trying to find something that can make our society more just, that we don't trample on that idea of the contribution of the individual. And I think stories are extremely good for that because they're imaginative and they teach values. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about the stories I know from Native America, the ones that you've told, the ones I know from our Cheyenne family, the ones I know from our Kiowa family. They all seem to be about connecting us and reminding us of what our real values are. So if you're inclined to tell a story, I would invite you to do so.
Well, I would love to. I love sharing our stories. I just want to underscore one of the things that you mentioned is that one of the functions of storytelling is to help correct the behaviors of a young person that maybe is doing or saying something that's inappropriate. So traditionally, what our people would do was, instead of scolding the child or punishing the child, they would tell that child a story. Mm. And maybe in that story there might be a character who's doing what the child was doing. Yeah. And so the child would hear what the feelings were about that kind of behavior, but without being ashamed and without losing face.
Yes.
And so the child could use that story to understand better what might have been a better way in which to behave. So that was one of the techniques for, as you mentioned, passing on values from one generation to another, was through stories. And like I mentioned before, we have all kinds of stories. We have those kinds of stories that remind me of Aesop's fables, stories
Right.
with a moral, stories with a teaching. And some people like to call those lesson stories. And then we have stories that explain why things are the way they are, like why do the leaves turn color in the fall, and why does Chipmunk have stripes on his back. And then we have funny stories, because we need humor,
Yes.
and we need sometimes to forget about our problems for a little while. And we have personal stories. We have stories that talk about our history, and we have stories that explain what our relationship is with one another and the rest of the universe. And we have old stories and we have new stories.
Great.
So one of the stories that I learned from Ray Fadden, who I mentioned earlier, was this one. And he said that this story may have been used to help those 5 nations that I mentioned before, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, to help them understand why it was important for them to unify, because long ago they weren't unified. They were fighting with one another. But somebody that we call the peacemaker came to us with a message of peace and unity, and Ray said that this might have been one of the techniques that he used to convince the people that they really needed to start talking about peace and to stop fighting. Long, long ago, there was a young boy who went into the forest. He was just enjoying the day, having a good time. He was feeling the wind blowing through his hair, and he could smell the smells of the various plants that were growing. But after a while, he got tired, and he decided to rest. And he saw a little hill, and he sat down at the bottom of that hill, and he just closed his eyes. He thought he'd just rest for a few moments and then continue on. But as soon as he closed his eyes, he heard a great ruckus, great noise coming from the other side of the hill. And so very quietly and cautiously, carefully, he crept to the top of that little hill, and he looked over. And what he saw was a great big black rat snake, and it was curled almost in a circle. And in the mouth of that snake was a great big bullfrog. And that snake was in the process of trying to swallow that bullfrog whole. Mm. Not because snakes are bad, but because that's what they need to do to survive. And he had that bullfrog by its back legs in its mouth, so that the head of the bullfrog and the front legs of the bullfrog were sticking out of the frog's mouth, of the snake's mouth. Well, as the boy watched, that bullfrog was disappearing slowly but surely down the throat of the snake, and the boy felt bad for the bullfrog. So he said to the bullfrog, "Why don't you do to the snake what the snake is doing to you?" And that bullfrog, he didn't have time to waste. He couldn't think about it too long. He had a limited amount of time, and he didn't have a plan B. He didn't know what else to do, and he noticed that the snake's tail was right by his mouth. And so he swallowed the tail of the snake. And as the boy watched, that snake started to disappear down the throat of the bullfrog. But at the same time, the bullfrog was also disappearing down the throat of the snake. And the circle that they made was getting smaller and smaller and smaller until there was nothing left. They swallowed each other up. And so it's said that that will be us if we continue to fight with one another. We will swallow each other up. We will destroy each other, and there'll be nothing left for the future generations to enjoy. And so that's how that story goes.
I love that story. I think that story says everything we need to know about what we're doing today and where we need to go as a nation. I mean, I think I heard some comment today even where somebody was commenting on the fact that one of the younger congresswomen had made some very off-color remark calling the president a name, and then there was a comment back by the president, and then the comment of the person writing was like, well, it was kind of like, well, he started it, so he uses words like that. So, and I feel like a lot of that's, aside from being incredibly immature and being like the response of a 5-year-old, well, they started it, so it's not, I mean, it's not getting us anywhere. And it's coming from a place of revenge, like what this story speaks to. If we're going to constantly come from a place of revenge, or he did it first, or she did it first, then we're not going to get anywhere at all. And I love that story because it speaks to where people have been in the past and where we are today. And I think when you mentioned those historical stories, in our culture, we have people have heard over and over again, those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. But that is what's happening. We are not telling our old stories, and we're not telling them in the context of a new story, which is one of the things I've heard both you and Tom say during storytelling is about speaking to the audience you're in front of. Tom said it once about somebody asked him why the Haudenosaunee or Haudenosaunee don't write down the entire Great Law of Peace. And he said, because it's not supposed to be experienced that way. I'm supposed to tell it to you the way you need to hear it. And you're supposed to listen to it the way you need to hear it. It's an experience that we are having together. And when I tell it again tomorrow, it won't be the same. So I think it's that personal experience with each other and the lesson of the story, the value of the story. And like we're discussing now, relating the old story to what's going on now so that we can sit and have a discussion about, well, is this really the choice we want to make? Do we really want to continue this back and forth, this he said, and so he did it first, I did it first, she did it first, is that the road we want to go down? Or do we want to find a place where we can all come to an agreement and peace?
And it's in the process of storytelling, I've heard people tell stories in a disrespectful way, because they think that's the only way that they can hold the attention of their listeners.
Yeah.
And I think that's too bad, because that's not really giving credit to the listeners,
yes,
whether they're children or adults, and we're modeling for the listeners, whether they're adults or children. When we're doing storytelling, we're modeling. And if we want to model respectful speech, respectful listening, respectful for each other, then that's what we need to do in our storytelling, as opposed to trying to use gimmicks,
right,
that might be demeaning or dehumanizing to somebody else in order to maybe get a laugh or to keep people's interest. So, that's one of the things I talk to people about, the process of telling stories. But that, I think, holds true for any interactions that we have. You know, where if we see and hear people talking disrespectfully to each other all the time, then that becomes the norm, and that's what people will do, whether they're children or adults.
And that is certainly that is certainly something that we really, I think, need to look at, that is so strongly developed in the Haudenosaunee culture, is that idea of the role model. So that your leaders are role models. They're models of good character. They're models of the good mind, not the quick mind. So I really feel like we need to go in that direction. We need to learn the lessons of your culture so that we can fix our culture. And I think that I was with a Choctaw woman, I've mentioned her before on the show a few months ago, who was talking about how in this modern world, we need to go back to some of the old ways. We need to start looking to some of these older cultures who were able to live in peace, who did have teachings about connecting to nature and the importance of nature and the importance of community and family, and that and these things were taught in a very experiential and fun way. So like you said, where we're not humiliating the child, and is a kid really going to remember? You go, don't do that. They're going to remember they got yelled at. They might not even remember what they got yelled at for. But like you said, if you're telling them a story and the story has a lesson in it, and then you have a discussion with them about it, you might never even need to mention the exact thing that they did. They get it. They understand it through the story. And I think we have a lot of grown-ups that need to hear a lot of your stories.
We as human beings, we all need reminders. We're forgetful. We're not perfect. We forget. And when you were talking about leaders, that reminded me of one of the characteristics that our people look for in a good leader is someone who doesn't anger easily.
Right.
Because it's very difficult to make good decisions when you're angry. We talk about that in our speech. We say he spoke in the heat of anger. Right. And that's supposed to be an apology for saying something maybe that was inappropriate because the person was angry. So we in our leaders, we try to look for people who don't anger easily and can stay focused and try to come up with ideas that are good for everybody. But and that's reflected in some of our stories too. So if we hear a story, for instance, about when bear and turtle have a race, bear in this story is very boastful, and so
you can tell the
in
story.
the end that works against him.
Right.
So it's a lesson that's heard in the story, again, so that the listener isn't losing face. But also it explains some other things that happen in nature, too.
Well, I'd love to hear you tell that story. That's one of my favorites that you tell. So, we do have time if you would like to share that one or any other one. We definitely have time for another story.
Well, this story is one, I believe, I'm not quite sure where I heard it. I might have heard it from Ray Fadden as well, and it's very well known among our people. Long, long ago, Bear was walking through the woods, and he was doing his most favorite thing, which was talking about himself. He would walk through the woods, and in a very loud voice, so everybody could hear him, he would say, "I am Oguali, the bear, and I am very, very handsome." And all of the creatures that heard him would have to nod in agreement. He was very, very handsome, very good looking, and Of course, they didn't like hearing him saying that all of the time, but it was true. I am Ogwali, and I am very, very powerful. And again, the creatures would nod in agreement. He was very powerful, but of course they were tired of hearing him boasting about it all the time. I am Ogwali, and I am very, very fast. I'm so fast that I bet I could beat any creature in this forest if we had a race. Well, at that point, a little voice said, excuse me, Ogwali, but I think I could beat you in a race. Well, Ogwali the bear was very shocked to hear such a statement, and he couldn't figure out who had said it. He looked all around and didn't know who said it, so he repeated himself, and he said, I am Ogwali, and I am the fastest creature in the forest. And again a little voice said, I think I could beat you. And that's when Ogwali looked down and he saw what looked like a rock on the path. And he picked it up and realized it wasn't a rock at all. It was actually a turtle. It was Turtle that was speaking to him. And Turtle said, oh, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I think if we had a race, maybe I could beat you. Well, at that point, Ogwali realized that all of the creatures of the forest were paying very close attention. They were very curious as to what Ogwali was going to say or do next. And so Ogwali said, oh, how could we have a race? I'm a creature of the land. You're a creature of the water. But that little turtle said, well, there's a stream right nearby, and I could swim in the water, and you could run alongside the water, and that's how we could have our race. And Bear looked at the stream, and he said, well, it's getting cold, and there's a layer of ice on the water. How will I know where you are? And Turtle said, well, I'll make holes in the ice, and every now and then when I'm swimming, I'll peek up through one of the holes in the ice, and you'll be able to see where I am. Well, by then, Ogwali the bear, he couldn't think of any other excuses not to have this race, and he realized he better do so because otherwise the creatures might think that he was worried about this threat. And so he said, okay, I'll meet you here tomorrow morning. And the next morning, all of the creatures of the forest were waiting. They wanted to see what was going to happen. They were talking about it, and they said, wouldn't it be wonderful if Turtle could beat Bear? If he could beat Ogwali, then we wouldn't have to listen to him bragging about that all of the time. But then they said, oh, how could that happen? That Turtle, he's so slow. Well, just then, Ogwali started to appear from out of the forest. He was walking toward the starting line, and he waited, and eventually Turtle showed up, and he was so excited about the race. Turtle had painted his cheeks red for the occasion. Jitsu the fox said, get on your mark, get set, go. And when he said go, Turtle jumped into the water, and he started swimming under the ice. Well, Ogwali, the bear, he didn't want anyone to think that maybe he was worried about this race. So instead of running, he just started ambling alongside the stream. But when he looked over at the water, he saw a little green head with red painted cheeks peek up through a hole in the ice, and Turtle was ahead of him. And he thought, oh, I didn't realize he was such a fast swimmer. Maybe I better start jogging. And so he started to run alongside the stream, and he looked over at the stream, and he saw that little green head with red painted cheeks peek up through another hole in the ice even further ahead. And so Ogwali the bear thought, oh, I underestimated that Turtle. Maybe I better start sprinting. And he started to run as fast as he could. He was running harder and harder, and he looked over at the stream, and there was Turtle crawling out of the water, and he was on the land, and he crossed the finish line way ahead of Bear. Well, Bear was so embarrassed because he had done all that bragging. He was so ashamed that instead of being a good sport and going to the finish line and congratulating Turtle, he turned around and he went into the forest and found a nice cozy place to sleep for the rest of the winter. He was so tired, he slept through the whole winter. And even to this day, that's what bears do. They remember their ancestor who had that race, and they get tired just thinking about it. So they sleep most of the winter. Well, all of the creatures congratulated Turtle. They said, "This is wonderful. We won't have to listen to Bear bragging, at least until spring." And they congratulated him, and they all went home until finally just Turtle was left. He turned, and he faced the water, and he called out, "Brothers, sisters, cousins." And from every hole in the ice appeared a little green head with red painted cheeks, all looking the same, all looking just like him. And he said, "Nyawagoa, thank you very much," he said. And so we find out that bragging isn't a very good idea, but we also find out that we can accomplish the impossible when we work together, when we cooperate. And that's what those turtles did. And that's how that story goes.
I love that story. That's so great. What's interesting is I will say that I've told that story, and that kids will sometimes say, "Well, didn't the turtles cheat?" Which I find very interesting that a lot of times they'll bring that up. And that does give you the opportunities for some really interesting discussion about, well, that what was more important in this situation. Bear really needed to be taught a lesson, and it didn't seem like anybody could teach this bear a lesson. And the turtles figured out a way to.
Or what could the turtles done differently?
Ah, yes. Yes, exactly. Wonderful. It's just wonderful, and that's the thing. There's nothing that can happen from storytelling that isn't a positive result. Sitting, discussing, and even like we said the other day, that even if we find out we just don't agree, we really don't agree on this. You think the turtles were cheating. I think they were teaching the bear a lesson, and they were using teamwork, and that's okay. It's okay for us to disagree, as long as we're respecting each other within that disagreement. And I also think that when we're discussing, like you said, what could the turtles have done differently, maybe we do come up with something that could be done differently, a compromise situation, something that would make everybody happy. But we don't have that opportunity if we're not talking to each other and we're not listening to each other. And storytelling is a wonderful way of training people to really listen. To listen with their hearts and their minds and their ears, and to really we're always talking, we throw that term around all the time. We do it with our kids now, to be present, to be mindful. There's nothing better than storytelling for that. If you can't sit and meditate, listen to a storyteller. I think I told you once that, I have a nephew who's very antsy and, very, very busy, very, very bright. And as a lot of very bright children are, they're very busy, they're very curious. And I will put on your storytelling tapes, and he has gone through the entire tape, one to the other. And I think it's just a wonderful thing to do with children. And I've told you, and adults, a lot of us are really antsy. A lot of us are anxious. A lot of us are running from one thing to the other, and we try and sit and meditate, and all we're doing is thinking about what we're going to have to do after we're finished meditating. Whereas you sit down and listen to a storyteller, or you just clue in to something where your mind is and your heart is connected to something greater than yourself, and something that does definitely calm you down and center you and focus you so that you can go on from there.
I like to suggest to people when I'm done storytelling is that they should consider going home and sharing their own stories with their families.
Yes.
Their stories about what happened in their lives, stories that they dreamt about, talk about their hopes and dreams for the future, so that that door to communication is open, and so that we understand each other a little bit better in terms of, well, why is it that we feel this way or that way about certain issues? And when we share our stories, then we find we have more in common than we have differences.
Yeah, I totally agree. We were actually very inspired by your stories, by your people, and we have a women's circle that we do. We're doing our winter women's circle is all about coming together and telling each other stories, the stories of our personal lives or stories that have meaning for us that we've heard, whatever they are. But much like was done in the old days where wintertime was story time, we're going to try and resurrect that tradition at our January Women's Circle because that it is so important. And I was even in talking to the woman who's my campaign manager, Sophia, she was talking to me about the power of telling her personal story to her family and how that was really a life-changing experience for her and continues to be that. It continues to resonate for her and heal her. And I think that is the power of story now, is that when you talk about then and now, I think that's really important to understand that these stories they're not just in the past. The concept of storytelling is not just in the past, that it has a great meaning and maybe even more value now than it ever has.
Yes, and I really think that in the process of telling a story, we learn a lot about ourselves too. That maybe we might not have realized if we hadn't heard ourselves saying those words out loud.
Right. And I think that, in the experience of doing stories with kids will always ask you, well, how did you memorize that? And it's interesting. It's no different really than acting a role, than taking a role, because you can only act something that you resonate with, that means something to you. And it's the same thing I find with storytelling. It's the same thing with me. I can hear a story once that resounds in my heart and soul, and I'll remember it. I really don't need to hear it again. And I might listen to it again and again to figure out what it means to me, but those are the ones that I tell easily. And I don't know if you have that same experience, that it's just what you said, that there are certain stories that speak to you personally and you find very easy to share with others.
Yes, definitely. And there's sometimes there's a story that I'll hear that I'm just not comfortable telling until one day I have an aha moment, and I realize, oh, now I understand that story, or now I have at least one understanding of that story, and then all of a sudden that story shines for me in a way that it didn't before.
Yeah, and I think that can happen with storytelling, with different experiences, even as we get older. Even the stories that we tell, or when we're younger, we're not telling anymore, and we have different stories now that we're older. So, Kay, that brings us to the end of our show. And I just want to thank you again. I don't know if you have a closing word or two.
Oh, share your stories.
Great advice.
Share. I think it's key for all of us.
Oh, thank you again so much. And thank you all for listening. And hopefully we'll be back together again next week from 4 to 5 on Sunday on Strong Island Radio. And there's a lot of great stuff going on here on Strong Island Radio. So please check out the live podcast, the live radio, the live television. A lot of interesting, wonderful things are expanding here. And once again, as always, thank you, Bobby, LaSarah. Thank you so much. And thank you all.
Thank you.